For better or for worse, we live in an age of constant remakes and remasters. It's almost like a slot machine with high quality remakes such as Demon's Souls or complete misfires such as Warcraft 3 Reforged. I am of the opinion that remakes are great for games that had a ton of potential but didn't quite reach it for whatever reason. Whether it be for technical glitches or poor design decisions, a second stab at a game can be very beneficial, especially with the advancements in technology since then. Please note that this list is not in any particular order and is just a collection of games that I feel will benefit greatly from either a remake or a remaster. In addition, this list is not a breakdown of whether or not these games will be remade, since the chance of that happening for many of these is pretty rare. Sounds good? Let's begin.
Lionheart, Legacy of the Crusader.
What do you get when you create an alternative historical world filled with historical figures such as Leonardo da Vinci, William Shakespeare, add some fantasy RPG elements including the special system, and make it into an isometric RPG? You get Lionheart, Legacy of the Crusader. The premise is pretty freaking awesome and the game lives up to it in the beginning at Barcelona. Afterwards, the game takes an unfortunately massive nosedive in quality once the story progresses and you have to leave there. I think it's safe to say the biggest issue comes down to the fact that it was incredibly rushed. After you leave Barcelona, the game goes from being a very interesting CRPG to a badly done clone of Diablo in an instant. It's a shame too, despite all of its flaws, I still come back to it trying out different character combinations and discovering something new every time. Even though the graphics were criticized at the time, I really enjoy this art style. Games like Pillars of Eternity show that isometric RPGs of this ilk can still look good given the proper care and attention. From a gameplay standpoint, a nice rebalancing would go a long way, especially for various schools of magic. So many of them had potential on paper, but really paled in comparison to more physical tools such as bows and swords. Couple that with the removal of the more tedious sections along with a more fleshed out narrative, and you got yourself a pretty good time.
Wing Commander, Privateer.
We are reaching way back with this one with the year 1993. Back in the day, most of PC gaming was being designed for MS-DOS. Thankfully, with the advent of DOSBox, playing these games nowadays are easier than ever. However, that doesn't mean that a remake wouldn't benefit these games tremendously outside of the obligatory modern resolution support. Wing Commander Privateer is a spin-off of the main Wing Commander series. Instead of battling against the Kilrathi for the survival of humanity, this game has you play as a common smuggler traveling the galaxy, completing various missions and odd jobs. Completing these jobs will grant you more money and the ability to purchase better ships and various upgrades. Even with more modern titles such as Elite Dangerous and the X series, it's surprisingly still fun to play, especially with a flight stick. However, there are some serious limitations that a remake would be able to address easily. For one, you'll get attacked constantly in the rear by enemies. When this happens, it's basically game over even with the more powerful ships. Having more upgrades to combat enemies not in your direct view would be great. 2. The view of what you can see often feels cramped. I understand this reasoning for the first ship, but the others shouldn't feel this way. Support for higher resolution and possibly making the game in full 3D will help with this tremendously. Third, the game has some of the worst scaling I have ever seen for a sandbox experience. The missions and enemies scale to the amount of total assets you have. So if you just bought a new ship but the weapons are lacking, that's too bad as you'll be facing incredibly tough enemies. Even just holding the cash and not spending it will cause so many difficulty spikes. Removing the scaling entirely and just having a difficulty system similar to X3 would go a long way.
Impossible Creatures.
Being able to combine creatures and make your own was a pretty awesome concept then and even now. I recommend this real-time base building strategy game in the past and I still do today. It's a shame for how good this game is there was no follow-up, especially for how the game ended on a cliffhanger. If a sequel is not possible, a remake will definitely do the trick. One thing I would have loved to see is an expansion of the creature creator formula. Instead of just taking 2 creatures, it would have been even more expansive with up to 3, 4, and even 5 creatures all at once. Imagine taking the wings of a hawk, the head of a rhino, the tail of a shark, the legs of a cheetah, and the arms of a bear. This can possibly be the greatest creature ever made, or a crazing abomination that is still intriguing or useful in some way. The linear campaign provided is definitely still fun, but something like a grand campaign similar to Total War would be very interesting and possibly add some replay value. You could have it that each territory you control determines the animals you can combine. If not, a random map feature for both multiplayer and against the AI would be great.
Alpha Protocol.
If this game wasn't such a buggy mess, it would have been considered an all-time classic. That's how bad the release was botched. On paper, it's not hard to see why. Alpha Protocol was an RPG developed by the highly respected Obsidian Entertainment, Unlike other RPGs that are mainly fantasy based, this one was based off of being an agent of a government agency that only a few select people actually know about. Funny thing is, I actually really like this game, but it's an incredibly flawed experience from beginning to end. Narratively speaking, the game does a great job in utilizing player choice to weave a narrative. There are multiple endings within the game with different variations depending on the actions taken. Some characters you can keep alive while others you can leave for dead. You really can take your own character named Michael Thornton and shape him to be a professional soldier, a suave agent, or a pure sociopath, or even a mixture of all of it. All of this is great and should be maintained, but the overall technicalities in combat need an overhaul. Playing a stealth character is easily the preferred option. Maxing out stealth, you can basically run behind enemies and take them down without anyone hearing you. Combine this with a stealth suit and you've basically won the game, even on hard. There are boss battles that force combat, but many of these can be exploited with the right abilities. Reworking the combat and removing boss battles entirely may actually serve the game better overall.
Lords of Magic.
Whenever I can, I find a way to sneak in Lords of Magic on these lists. I've included it in my awesome 90s computer games list, I've reviewed it with well-deserved praise, and now I'm requesting a remake to this cult classic. As a quick refresher, you pick one of 8 factions as one of 3 classes, Warrior, Thief, and Mage. Your goal is to defeat Balkoth and save all of Urak. It plays like a combination of both the Heroes of Might and Magic series and the Lords of the Realm games. Overall, it's still fun, but the age is definitely showing considering that this game was made back in 1997. This means that the resolution was restricted to only 800 by 600. While you technically can manually edit the resolution through shenanigans, a modern remaster with modern resolution support will go a long way for playability. It'll essentially be beneficial regarding the battles, giving players the ability to see much more on the screen at once. The game had a very unique system of asymmetrical warfare. Each faction was very different in how they played, resulting in very unique playstyles for each of the factions. This inevitably led to some huge imbalances, with some races being incredibly OP while others felt incredibly weak. This could have been caused by an overpowered early game spell, units that favored the meta, or artifacts that had the potential to break the game. A nice rebalancing would help to get rid of that unfair feeling many of these 90s games had. One of the biggest issues with the original game for me is replay value. While the original map is fun to play with, a random map feature would have added so many more hours to my playtime. I also just imagine what it would have been like to have 8 players battling for supremacy of Urak. The original game allowed for up to 4 players, but that was quite a pain to get setting up with a modem back in the day. Modern multiplayer would really go a long way in terms of adding unpredictability to the game. You can have arch rivals fire and water teaming up against earth and air. It'll create a layer of dynamic storytelling and even some role-playing opportunities amongst friends.
Beyond Divinity.
Good lord, there's a reason this is considered the worst game in the Divinity series by far. The issues are numerous, but I've already discussed it in the review, so let's just get to how to fix it. First, rebalance the combat and dungeons with a lot less BS. If you're going to make a very linear game, at least make it balanced throughout. Second, please re-record all the lines with better voice actors. These are somehow worse than what Divine Divinity has, with half of the charm. Third, please fix the bugs. Despite this game being far less ambitious than the previous game, it has just as many if not more bugs to deal with. I even discovered some myself, including the infinite poison arrow glitch. I would even take it a step further and change the combat system to resemble something more akin to Original Sin. This was the first game that had you play as 2 characters at once, similar to what was done in the first Original Sin. Considering that we may as well give the skill tree system a whole rework as well, with skills that actually freaking work, this is a perfect reason to do it.
King Arthur, the role-playing war game.
King Arthur the role-playing war game was a Total War as strategy game that predated the first Total War Hammer by about 7 years. Even though the latter is the far superior game in almost every way, the King Arthur mythos is fun and unique enough in its own right. I've played a ton of the Welsh Druids campaign, going through the various quests, getting married, and managing my realm. Even now, it has some features that aren't in Warhammer 3, including the adventure book style quests. These were a ton of fun with various branching paths leading to different results. I've done a full review on the original along with the sequel, but the biggest improvement will need to be applied to the combat. Unit collision is not very natural as they get sucked in once they become in contact. There really isn't any physics system to speak of, and maneuvering units feels sluggish even when using cavalry. Couple that with the poor animations of units swinging wildly and somehow doing damage, and you got yourself some late 2000s jank. This game also suffered from some of the worst difficulty spikes I've ever experienced in a strategy game. Once you get past a certain point in the main campaign, you'll be attacked constantly by armies full of top tier mythical units while you're only equipped with a dagger and some burlap. Thankfully, archers were stupidly OP, so a team of these could easily take down anything. Obviously, a rebalancing is once again in order, as well as some new mythical units to unlock and play around with. Instead of just doing either an Arthurian campaign or one of the DLC campaigns, it should instead be treated as more of a sandbox with multiple factions to choose from, with the Arthurian one being the more story focused. It'll help to expand replayability with multiple start locations and also create the possibility of either a co-op or competitive campaign. Add in some more mythical units and you have yourself a pretty fine remake or remaster or soft remake or whatever the hell you want to call it. Just do it.
Star Wars Shadows of the Empire.
To a good portion of you and myself, I have fond memories of this game back in the N64 days. To my shock, it actually was released for PC. I bought it on GLG recently and gave it a spin. I gotta say, this is definitely a game better remembered than played, but it doesn't mean that it won't benefit from a full-on remake. The Star Wars Extended Universe was something I was very fond of growing up. Characters like Kyle Katarn, Jan Ors, and the main protagonist of this one, Dash Rendar, are all very memorable to me. The story here is an overall solid one, and not much will need to be done there. Still, the game would greatly benefit from the inclusion of high-quality AAA cutscenes and possibly extend the game with events from the novel this is related to. Another big selling point for this game was the sheer amount of variety. So much was packed in this title, including ship combat, speeder bike combat, turret sections, and on foot sections featuring a ton of platforming and some unique but frustrating boss battles. Many of these levels will benefit from a modern coat of polish, especially regarding controls of on foot sections. Those controls made platforming 10 times harder than needed.
Shadow Watch.
I am a huge fan of many squad-based turn-based tactical games. Silent Storm is one of my all-time favorites, but there is another that I am somewhat fond of, at least up to a point. Shadow Watch was released in 2000 based on the Tom Clancy's novel of the same name. What stood out to me most was its comic book art style, which reminded me of the Men in Black cartoon for some reason. It also had a randomized campaign with various branching paths within. All that is great, but what really suffered was the combat. The game is grid-based, so your characters are locked to it when moving. This is all fine and good until you realize that the only way to move them was to painstakingly click on a direction button to move a handful of steps. Why you couldn't just left click on the tile and right click to confirm? I don't know. It was a poor design decision that ultimately hampered the game. Outside of the movement, the missions are actually pretty well done. You have a small squad to work with, all specializing in their own equipment and skill tree. It's important to know if you're willing to risk an alarm going guns a-blazing, or to take a far more stealthy approach with pick locks and silent takedowns. While they may not have the voice lines of Silent Storm, each character does have their own personality, quirks, and a bio. It's a shame that we never got a sequel, as the seeds were planted and were ready to be harvested.
Fallout Tactics.
The Fallout series has had its ups and downs. While some people would probably prefer remakes of 1 and 2, those games are still playable and don't need too many revisions in my opinion. What does, however, is Fallout Tactics, a game that had potential to be very awesome but fell short by some fundamental missteps. The first is easily the combat. It features combat similar to the first 2 games, as well as a real-time option that is too unwieldy for its own good. On paper, this sounds fine until you realize that you either have slow as molasses combat or have fast as the Roadrunner mosh pits. The better option would be to stick with one and polish it to the best you can, preferably turn-based. Having the special system here was a no-brainer. Almost all the secondary skills are ported over, but honestly, that's one too many. Many of these skills serve no combat benefit, which is the majority of the game. A simplifying of these skills while keeping the special system would do the game wonders. Add in a nice rebalancing to make melee more useful in the later stages, and you'll have yourself a game far better than Fallout 76 ever could dream of. So there it is, 10 games that could seriously benefit from a remake or a remaster. Some definitely need it more than others, but what did you guys think of the list? As always, thank you guys for watching. Please like, share, and subscribe. And this is Powerhouse, signing off.